We negate, resolve, on balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat that Russia poses to Western interests. Observation: according to International Relations, universal human rights is a construct that directly originated from Western ideologies and is considered expressive of Western interests. To effectively assess the resolution with respect to Western interests, the economic sanctions' effects on human rights must be evaluated. Contention 1: increased human rights abuses. Economic sanctions in Russia result in an increase in human rights abuses. Firstly, according to Dursun Peksin from the University of Memphis, authoritarian leaders like Putin use economic hardship as a strategic tool to bolster support for aggressive behavior. Economic sanctions worsen government respect for physical integrity rights, including freedom from torture and political imprisonment. Economic coercion remains a counterproductive policy tool, even when sanctions are specifically imposed with the goal of improving human rights. Furthermore, according to the American interest, Russian counter-sanctions will exacerbate the problem by provoking a sharp rise in food prices that accounts for 32% of Russian spending. Russian authority counteractions trying to oppose the sanctions deliver a serious blow to Russia's poor, and the impacts are twofold. First, loss of freedom of press. Peksin finds that economic sanctions restrict interactions with the outside world, causing a decrease in the probability of no press freedom by 132%, a direct violation of the human right for freedom of opinion and information. 2. Inadequate living standards. CNN finds that the inflation resulting from economic sanctions has increased the number of Russians living in poverty by 3 million people. Now there are 23 million Russians living under the poverty line, violating the human right for an adequate standard of living. Contention 2. Syria. Economic sanctions are the reason for Putin's increased military involvement in the Syrian civil war. Fisher of Vox writes in 2015 that Putin had expanded his military presence in Syria, hoping to use it as part of a large-scale geopolitical gambit to have sanctions lifted. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told a Western news source that Russia would be willing to make an agreement with the West about Syria, but only if the sanctions were lifted. Russian military involvement in the region poses a threat to Western interests for two distinct reasons. First, propping up Assad. General Petraeus commented last November that Russia's involvement in Syria has shifted the balance of power in Assad's favor against Western-backed rebels. As Obama explained in 2015, the West can never allow a dictator to slaughter tens of thousands of citizens, violate every Western human rights standard, and create massive instability. Assad must go. Second, proxy wars. Petraeus furthers that Russia had actually been aiming more at Western-backed rebels than ISIS. In fact, the Jerusalem Post pointed out just last week that a mere 10% of Russia's airstrikes are directed at the Islamic State. Most are directed at the West. The impact is a U.S.-Russia proxy war. Bernard of the New York Times writes in 2015 that Russia's attacks on Western allies threatens to turn the Syria into an all-out proxy war between the United States and Russia. Jeffrey White writes that Russian intervention in Syria guarantees victories for the Assad regime over the rebel forces, and continues to state that Russian intervention in Syria also has a serious implication for Israel, a major Western ally, by strengthening Hezbollah, the major terrorist organization. Jeffrey White continues to explain that Russia's presence in Syria can complicate the U.S.'s fight against the Islamic State. Contention 3. Cyber warfare. Business Insider's Kalin in 2015 writes that Russia is now the leading perpetrator of cyber warfare worldwide and is coordinating activity almost entirely directed against Western targets. Professor Mike Jackson, a computer security expert at Birmingham City University, finds that in response to EU sanctions, Russia is looking to retaliate using cyber warfare. This has been seen empirically as, according to cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike, economic sanctions have led to a 300-fold increase in the number of threatening cyber attacks from Russia against the United States. Moreover, former chief of the U.S. Army's warfare states that Russia's cyber capabilities are 10 times that of the U.S., and we are very unprotected from their attacks. And as Napolitano says, as Napolitano estimates, the chances of a cyber attack on the power grid are up to 80 to 90%. Cohn of Business Insider finds a cyber attack which shuts down part of the United States power grid could cost as much as $1 trillion to the U.S. economy, plunging the world economy into a depression never seen before. Thus, vote con.
Are judges ready?
Yep.
Judges ready? Opponents ready?
Yeah.
Student ready? Starting now. We affirm resolved on balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests. We begin with the following definitions for clarification. We define the West as the European Union and NATO, and the European Union defines Western interests as focusing on making governing institutions more transparent and democratic, which can be achieved through gaining power and influence. Next, U.S. foreign policy expert defines sanctions as tools used by countries or international organizations to persuade a particular government to change their policy by restricting trade, investment, or other commercial activity. Contention 1, preventing militarization. The annexation of Crimea by Russia was devastating to Western interests. According to the RFVRL, Ukraine's National Security Council has approved a new military doctrine that calls for the country to pursue a NATO membership. Additionally, Carnegie Europe finds Ukraine is significant for the entire EU in terms of political stability, security, and energy-related matters. Subpoint A, economics. The International Monetary Fund explains that sanctions imposed on Russia because of its support for separatists in Ukraine could shrink the economy by as much as 9% over time. In fact, the sanctions, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, are forcing the government to make budget changes that prevent military modernization. For example, the lack of imports have caused major delays in Navy shipbuilding plans. Subpoint B, deterrence. The Economist explains the concept, saying it is possible that Putin would have acted even more aggressively had sanctions not been imposed. Second, sanctions can be used as a bargaining chip to be conceded later when the other side is coaxed into talks. Reuters finds that after the first round of sanctions in 2014, there was a significant drawback of Russian troops from Crimea. Lana Dreyer explains that sanctions have already had an impact in the short term and will continue to do so in the medium term as they made Russia seriously factor in possible Western responses. Per Olson concludes, economic sanctions have impacted the Russian economy negatively. The geopolitical tension, threats of sanctions, and the imposing of sanctions have harmed the confidence of investors to Russia. Contention 2, capital outflow. Because of economic sanctions, capital outflow is occurring in Russia. According to the central bank, capital outflow is a consequence of the growth of dollar deposits and the repayment of foreign debts by Russia's private sector due to the limited possibility of refinancing debt because of the economic sanctions. Santander explains that geopolitical tensions between Russia, Ukraine, and the Western countries have sent a particularly negative signal to investors and, as a consequence, FDI fell sharply in 2014. A decrease in foreign direct investment in Russia occurs also because of tax increases due to economic sanctions. As Reuters explains, President Vladimir Putin has decided to introduce a sales tax on Russian consumers, raising the tax burden earlier than expected as Western sanctions deepen the country's financial woes. Russian central bank quantifies. In 2014, Russia witnessed a 250% increase in capital outflow compared with 2013, while FDI practically ceased. Pulse Institute of International Affairs finds that the capital outflow is equivalent to $154 billion. RBTH furthers that there are currently direct and indirect bans on investing in Russia, and our Western partners now have doubts about some of Russia's large-scale projects. There are major implications to capital outflow. As Investopedia explains, capital outflow is considered undesirable and results from political or economic instability. It occurs when foreign and domestic investors sell off their assets in a particular country because they no longer perceive it as a safe investment. The capital is withdrawn from the country and may end up in another country or back in the investor's home. The impacts are twofold. The first is economic loss. The Moscow Times explains capital flight from Russia is forecast to hit $110 billion this year as Western sanctions limit foreign investment and force Russian companies to pay off billions of dollars in foreign debt. The second is brain drain. Bone of National Interest finds that it is not just capital and investment that is fleeing the country, but some of Russia's best and brightest minds. Cross-border Capital calculates that $124 billion left Russia in 2014 due to increasing emigration. Since Pro puts Putin in his place, we are very proud to affirm.
Before we start the crossfires, okay, like call for the cards?
Sure.
Can I see the 124 billion?
Are you getting ready to do this prep?
Yeah, we're going to do
Oh, okay.
it. Is that
Before
before
cross?
cross to the.
I don't care as long
Yeah.
as you using prep.
Yeah.
Okay, so which one? Just the one?
The 124.
In our...
Capital, your brain drain.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay.
It's just the highlighted portion.
Okay, we'll start prep now.
Alright, those 23 seconds. Can we keep it during crossfire by Asian too?
Actually, no, you can give it back.
If you need it back,
Give it. Give it.
I mean,
Okay.
like, just in case our partner needs.
Okay,
it.
sure.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay.
Okay, are you ready?
Yes.
All the judges ready? All right, can I have the first question?
Yes.
All right, so it looks like your whole first contention is basically like founded on the premise that they're going to keep expanding and that it's all, is that correct? Like this annexation that they're going to keep asserting their military strength?
Well, in our contention, when we're saying how sanctions prevent militarization that would have happened without sanctions.
Right, so can you provide me like any example where this has empirically happened? Because
Well, like,
currently in the status quo, there's still
For
expanding.
example, like right after sanctions were imposed in Ukraine, there was a drawback of troops from the border of Ukraine.
Okay, how many troops?
I believe it was, I don't
Because
remember exactly.
currently they're backing Russians, they're backing separatists in Ukraine in the status quo
Okay, but
right
without
now.
sanctions, they would have been able to fund them even more because the sanctions are hurting the economy, thus they can't fund military as much.
I mean, we have evidence as recent as 2 weeks ago that says that they're backing these separatists
Okay, but
because they want to keep
without sanctions,
annexing
they would
them.
have even more. So that's why we're telling you that the sanctions are working to achieve their goal. So can I ask you a question?
Okay, sure.
Okay, so in your contention too about Syria, you talk about how Syria is willing to come to an agreement with the West as long as the sanctions are lifted, right?
Russia is willing to come.
Russia's willing to.
That's from their own foreign minister.
Okay, so basically you're telling me that sanctions cause them to come to the point where they're willing to come to agreement with the West, right?
What we're saying is that sanctions are the reason why they're not willing to come to an agreement
Wait,
right
you just
now.
said that they would come to an agreement if the sanctions were lifted. So,
That's correct.
So the implementation of sanctions caused them to want to come to an agreement.
No. We're saying the reason why they are not coming to an agreement right now, the reason why they're supporting Assad, the reason why these proxy wars are occurring is because of sanctions. We're saying if these sanctions were lifted, that's what will cause them to come to an
when did the
agreement.
proxy wars start? Did they start as soon as sanctions were implemented, or had they already been going on before?
These proxy wars have been exacerbated by the proxy wars. That's an exact word
Okay.
from the evidence that we can give you.
Okay, I would like to see that.
Okay, sure. Okay, can I have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about capital outflow, right?
Yeah.
So, can you quantify like how much of that occurred after sanctions? Because capital outflow has been occurring for quite a while before these sanctions were imposed.
So, well, in 2014, when sanctions were imposed, there was a 250% increase from 2013, which is significantly more than years before.
Okay, and this is
And
specifically
we give you the link
sanctions.
specifically why, because the sanctions prevent the refinancing of debt in Russia, and thus they must increase taxes and take money from their private sector.
Oh, okay. We'll respond to that in rebuttal. All right, you can have a question.
So, in your cyber war response, right? You talk about how and then in your framework you talk about how human rights abuses. Are you saying that they're the most important impact in today's round, or are you just saying they must be weighed?
We're saying that they're one of the most important impacts in this
Okay.
round because human rights are fundamental to Western culture.
Okay,
Remember
so
our
if we can prove that human rights, in other countries, not just in Russia, with the sanctions are being helped, then do we win the round?
No, because we have to be looking to Russia itself. Because its citizens are being harmed, because these Ukrainians are being harmed, freedom of press is
but
being
what if
taken away,
everywhere else
living
in
in
the
poverty,
world it's
3
not
million
happening?
increase in poverty. So, okay, you have to prove A, that the link is directly to sanctions.
Thank you. Take some front.
Alright, starting now. Alright, that's 58 seconds.
brief outline roadmap, or can we go over framework and then just have our case? Okay. Are we ready? Let's start on framework. Remember, what Pranav clearly tells you that human rights abuses is a Western cultural interest. Insofar as we're showing you that sanctions actually increase in human rights abuses, then we actually turn all their impacts against them. That sanctions are actually increasing the threat to Western interests. And second, insofar as we show you that expansion is actually increasing in the affirmative world, then we're going to be winning that point. Now, we went to the first contention on Russian expansion. We're going to have a couple of responses here. One, actually, due to sanctions, Putin will never back down. As The Economist explains in 2015, Putin went into Crimea because his approval ratings were falling. If Putin went back down, focus will be held on the bad economy and decreases his rating. Why? Putin wants to improve his legitimacy. How does he do this? He either shows his wealth or he shows his military strength. Now that economic sanctions are reducing the amount of the perception of his wealth, he's actually exacerbating his military strength, increasing the military budget by 33%, and actually going back into these countries. Remember in the crossfire, Pranav tells you that he's actually supplying troops and supporting separatists in Ukraine, which he wouldn't have done if the sanctions weren't there in the first place. But second, and even if you don't want to buy that, this is just blatantly not true. In fact, as of December 30th, with sanctions, Russia is sending troops again and providing funding and arms to separatists in both eastern Ukraine, and they're expanding into Central Asia. Right now, in the world of sanctions, there's still expansion occurring. Insofar as that is rooted to the anti-West sentiment caused by sanctions, you can see the link towards why sanctions are just increasing expansions. But let's go to Oxtentria of the Swedish Defense Research Agency in September of 2015, who finds that sanctions have not been enough to persuade the regime to back off and change its expansionist policies. Sanctions have no impact on Russian agenda. That's from the card. But next, let's go to another response. Sanctions actually caused Putin to increase his legitimacy, to keep up his popularity even during his bad time. According to DW.com, if the economy gets worse when the main source of legitimacy comes from a geopolitical conflict. Because sanctions hurt the economy, Putin is likely to create geopolitical conflicts. He's going to create geopolitical conflicts as a result of sanctions, not as with the absence of sanctions. That right there shows you the reason why Putin wants to increase his legitimacy. That's why he's expanding, not because the world of the affirmative, not because of the world of the negative. Next, they talk about foreign direct investment. They talk about why the Russian economy is decreasing. First, in the crossfire, they said Russia can't access loans. Guess what? In the world of sanctions, doesn't make anything better. And actually, what happens now is that Russia is going towards China, and they developed a new credit swap. The yuan. Simon de Galbert says that the yuan ruble mechanism is a currency swap by which that could give Russia more flexibility to access international financing and escape the liquidity shortage. What are they doing? They're going to China and still doing the exact same financing that they've done before. Sanctions do nothing but just increase the anti-West sentiment. You're only seeing expansion as the ultimate impact. Next, then let's keep on going to where FDI is not going to be decreasing. According to the Moscow Times, foreign direct investment is at an all-time high in Russia. You can call for this card. In fact, it rose 83% in 2014. This means sanctions are not affecting the flow of FDI. But second, FDI is not even affected by conflict. According to the Financial Times, Russia has continued receiving investments even after Ukraine from Chinese investors, also proving that Russia does not completely rely on the West. Next, according to the Financial Times, 50% of Russian companies are seeing attractive investments even with sanctions in place. You can call for this piece of evidence. It's clearly showing you that in the world of the affirmative, you're still seeing that FDI is increasing. You're still seeing that Russia is getting the loans. But what are you not seeing? You're not seeing that Russia is stopping its expansionist policies. You're not seeing that Russia is going away from Ukraine. You're seeing that they're going back into eastern Ukraine. You're seeing that they're going to Central Asia. Next, they talk about capital outflow. We're going to have a couple of responses here. Capital flight in 2014 was due to debt redemptions and not investors fleeing. There's a non-unique impact. Why is this so? Because the oil prices have been reducing so much so that their economy is being hurt. Capital flight is non-unique to sanctions. They were happened before with the same amount because the oil prices is such a big impact towards the Russian economy. They're the biggest exporter of oil. Insofar as that's true, that's a non-unique impact. But second, you can look to Business Insider, who finds that Russia also saw a high level of capital flight before sanctions. They aren't showing you a comparative increase in the capital flight before and after sanctions. There was a $61 billion loss in capitals before sanctions were increasing. Their $151 billion card of capital loss is actually non-unique because we show you that $61 billion were lost the year before. The oil prices are getting worse. That's the reason why the Russian economy is being hurt. That's the reason why investors are going away. Next, they talk about brain drain, but essentially they don't give you the warrant to why all these investors are leaving insofar as the economy is doing equally as well in terms of investment. And second, they just say that $124 billion is lost. They never tell you how much, why. $124 billion isn't just lost when people leave the economy. The card says that they could be valued at this much, but those are scientists. That is a theoretical impact. We're showing you that right now, the FDI is still at an all-time high. That is a tangible impact. That is not a speculation. Go for our piece of evidence, vote con.
Are all my judges ready? Are my opponents ready? Caitlin, are you ready? Okay, so starting now. So I'd like to start off with an overview. In response to the Russian annexation of Crimea, the West had three options: to use military force, maintain the status quo and do nothing, or implement sanctions. Taking military action would have resulted in a stunning blow to the West. The Pentagon and NATO ran 16 simulations if the West had used military force to stop Russia. Each simulation resulted in Russia not only defeating the West, but also gaining more control over the Baltic region. So, maintaining the status quo would allow more undeterred Russian aggression. However, by freezing assets, preventing effective mobilization, and unifying countries in opposition, the Harvard Welfare Center finds that the economic sanctions are extremely effective in preventing deadly conflict. Thus, the affirmative presents the only way to limit Russia's threat to Western interests. In response to their first contention about human rights, the resolution discusses the harm to Western interests. If we can prove that human rights across the board, not limited to Russia, is decreasing, you must affirm. Without the sanctions, Russia would have been able to militarize even more, and the decrease in militarization in Ukraine, as well as the deterrence of Putin's military activism because of the outflow of capital, has decreased the amount of human rights abuse that would have occurred without sanctions. Human rights also are not the only impact, because you have to remember the Western interests of democracy and economy. In response to their second contention about Syria, look at what's actually happening. CBS News explains that in November, Russia agreed to ally with the West to fight ISIS. Specifically, they agreed to use airstrikes to target terrorists and ISIS and not the forces on the ground. This means that Russia has agreed to not target any fighters rebelling against Assad. Russia is cooperating in Syria. David Sanger of the New York Times reports that the UN established a ceasefire and a peace deal in Syria on December 18th, which only passed because Russia aligned with the US on the vote. So turn their argument because sanctions have forced Russia to ally with the West. Their second impact about proxy wars. Make them prove that it will happen, otherwise our impacts outweigh on probability. There won't be a proxy war. This is because sanctions put pressure on Russia to act in concert with Western interests in the Syrian conflict, not against them, which is the link in a proxy war. Dina Guskavi of CNBC notes that Russia is expanding its military operations in Syria, and they share the common goal with the West, which is to defeat ISIS. In response to their third contention about cyber warfare, first, the Business Reporter in October 2015 writes that Russia has been trying to distance itself from the attacks coming from its independent hacker groups. Second, the Federal Security Service proves that in 2015, 74 million cyber attacks against Russia came from Russia itself. So they have to prove that there's a direct correlation between cyber attacks and sanctions. And I have more responses because the increase in cyber attacks has nothing to do with sanctions. Sanger of the New York Times reports that in 2011, the number of cyber attacks occurring worldwide was 17 times higher than it was in 2009. Then again, according to Chicago Tribune, cyber attacks went up another 32% in 2013. Cyber attacks in Russia have been going up because that's been the global trend over the past decade and not because of sanctions. And if you're worried about cyber attacks, it's useless to attack Russia. Keating of Slate reports that in 2014, Russia has instigated a measly 1.7% of attacks. In the grand scheme of things, that's a really small impact. And discarding sanctions is counterproductive because the Russian cyber attacks is doing exactly what Putin wants you to do. Even if Russia's performing more cyber attacks because of the sanctions, negating is letting Putin win. On balance, it's worth accepting a small increase in Russian retaliation as long as we can prove that Putin can't get away with whatever he wants. Remember the most important impacts of this round. The International Monetary Fund says that sanctions imposed on Russia could shrink the economy by up to 10%. The Russian Central Bank claims that the capital outflow is equivalent to $154.1 billion. Despite our opponents arguing that Putin's power is increasing, how can he continue to fund his arming of separatists if he doesn't have the resources to do it? Anti-Western sentiment and Putin's claims to increase his militarization have no impact because he cannot back up his policies as his economy is being crippled by the sanctions. They claim that Putin is creating geopolitical conflict, yet his international sphere of influence and his power is decreasing because Putin is disliked across the globe and only 24% of people find him favorable. Furthermore, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, which all used to belong to the USSR, don't like Russia anymore, which is a sign that the sphere of influence is decreasing. If Putin's power and influence is decreasing internationally, there's no way for him to extend his power to trading with other countries, including China. Please affirm. Thank you.
first, you begin this observation, or you riddle with like an observation that
Right.
three different scenarios, and then you say the status quo versus sanctions. Is the status quo without sanctions? Or
The
with
status,
sanctions?
so like what I meant by the status quo is like when you have three options, you can either, like in response to Russian aggression, you can either use military force, do nothing, which is what I was referring to as the status quo, or
Wait, do
implement
nothing.
sanctions.
Wait, so do nothing means doing sanctions? I was just confused.
No, I meant like before the sanctions were implemented. So status
Okay,
quo
okay, so
before
status quo is
sanctions
before
would be
sanctions.
doing nothing, and that's
Okay.
not effective because if you're not doing anything,
Okay, no,
Russian
sure.
aggression.
Okay, you have a question?
Yeah. Okay. So when you're saying with the cyber attacks, how
Yeah.
is that a direct link to sanctions?
So I'll give you two reasons. One, first off, you say that like it's always been an increase from Russia, whatever. But actually, we give you evidence that there's been a 300-fold increase just when sanctions were imposed. And
But
sure,
was
you're gonna
that
say,
becau-
well, yeah. So let me tell you why. Because essentially, what sanctions do is that they turn the Russian people against the West. It increases anti-West sentiment. What does this do? Hackers, individual hackers throughout Russia, and you try to like say that Russia tries to deny this. They're still part of Russia. So hackers in Russia are more anti-West because of these sanctions, and they use their cyber capabilities to attack the West.
Okay.
And there's been a 300-fold increase.
Okay.
110,000 attacks per month. Okay.
Okay. Can I see that card after?
Sure. So I had a couple of questions. How are you proving to me that human rights abuses are being decreased in the world of the affirmative insofar as expansion is not being stopped?
Okay, so the reason why it's decreasing is because if the sanctions weren't implemented, Putin would have continued his like military activism in Ukraine and probably would have spread to other areas around him that used to belong to the USSR, right?
Probably.
So then more human rights would have been violated if he had expanded without sanctions.
Well, I have two questions for that. Well, he's still expanding. That's my thing. And like,
Right,
and
okay, but
two-
I have a response to that also because we're showing you that his expansion is decreasing because he's losing capital and he can't fund his.
No, oh yeah. So what Pranav reads to you is that military budget is actually up by 33% even after
Right,
sanctions.
but okay, so
that's
can you tell me where the
completely
military
fine.
budget is coming from?
The whole budget.
No, it's becoming
From
so like,
from a reserve fund from Russia, which they actually keep just
Okay.
for the military. I can show you that.
right, but if once that's drained because of Putin's increasing militarization, which is what
Well,
you're
actually, yeah. Well, I have two things to say to that. One is that, like, I can show you that Russia's economy is actually doing a bit better now, so that they're not acting at a deficit. And two, I can say that your whole argument about Russia not getting funds and loans is actually completely wrong because they're going around the sanctions and going to China.
Right,
And
okay,
now,
but
I was just gonna say. So all you're saying to me is that Putin's gonna stop militarizing. All I'm saying is that sanctions just make him really angry. He still has the capability. How does he have the capability? He's going to China, still financing with this yuan, ruble.
The Chinese would rather trade with the West than with Russia because you can see that
Actually,
Chinese
no,
trade
go
is
ahead.
actually
What?
decreasing by 30% in 2015.
Chinese what?
Chinese trade with Russia.
Okay,
That's-
I can say that I can show you that they're increased by 40%.
Okay.
And also this, yuan, ruble, they have a swap. They created their own currency swap just so Russia could get around
How
these
does that harm
refinancing.
Western interests?
It's basically saying that you just told me that sanctions stop Russia from getting loans and refinancing for its military. I'm telling you that.
That's time. We can get back to this later.
Can I
Do you want to continue?
Yeah, I am telling you that there's something called a yuan ruble swap. What it helps is that they can now access the international credit markets through the yuan. I can give you the piece of evidence, and they're still getting all the
Okay.
loans. I can show you the piece of evidence right
All
now.
right, I'd like to see that.
This
Is this the whole card?
yeah.
So, are you all getting ready to take prep?
We can use some prep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, okay.
Oh yeah, are you ready? Or we'll take care of actually. I wanted to see a couple of pieces of evidence. Can we get back that part about capital loss? The 124.
Oh, yeah, again? Okay,
Yeah, and could I also see the 250% increase in capital outflow?
Yeah,
And that's the main one.
from our,
From your second contention.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was like the first card.
That's the first card.
Okay. These are the two cards that are highlighted.
We'll go ahead and start. Right.
Yeah.
Stop in front. I'm just gonna give this back to you.
Thank you.
Okay, continue in front.
Okay, that's it. Opponents ready? Kartik? All the judges? Okay. Main issues in this debate are going to come down to a few points. The first one is going to be their own contention and why we're winning on that, which is basically annexation and expansion. They keep on coming up here and saying that they don't have the military capacity to keep expanding. But remember, Kartik comes up here and tells you that there's a 33% increase in the amount of military budget that was increased in Russia just last year. This means that in the status quo, with sanctions being imposed, they're more incentivized to keep attacking. Kartik gives you the warrant to why. One, he wants to increase his legitimacy. He can do this in two ways. He can either flaunt his wealth or his military power. Now that his wealth is gone, that perception of wealth is gone, now he's flaunting his military power. We give you empirical examples of why this is occurring. One, Syria. We talk about how he's propping up Assad. That's going to be really important. I'll discuss it a bit later in my speech. And second, we're also talking about Eastern Ukraine. In the status quo, just 2 weeks ago, they're backing separatists in Ukraine. They're expanding in the status quo ideologically and physically. This is a major impact, remember. And then they come up here and say that basically like, oh, foreign direct investments are decreasing, their economy is collapsing. No, just in 2014, there was an 83% increase in foreign direct investment. Please go ahead and extend that card. That's going to be really important. Moreover, we ended this crossfire talking about the yuan-ruble exchange. What this basically means is that even though these sanctions are imposed, they're still getting access to all the money. They're still getting the money. The capital is still coming in. This is how they're financing all their stuff. Second is when we're going to be talking about human rights. They basically come up here and say that, oh, they can prove that, oh, they're helping other people in the world. But remember, they don't give you any specific examples, and they don't respond to our two impacts, where we say, one, we're taking away the freedom of press, and second, they're people living in poverty. It's key to Western interest. That's going to be another major issue. Then they move on and talk about cyber attacks, saying that we have no link. Our card, they can call for it right now, shows that there was a 300 gold increase in cyber attacks after sanctions were passed. That's a clear link right there. And moreover, we have another card saying that these Russians have anti-West sentiment, which is why they attack. Most important issue is Syria. We're seeing how they're backing a terrorist group, Hezbollah. We're seeing how they're backing Assad, who slaughters tens of thousands of citizens. That also ties into human rights impacts. But most importantly, you can see that their own foreign minister said they would be willing to make an agreement with the West about Syria, but only if sanctions were lifted. That gives us the critical link to sanctions. That's telling us that sanctions are the reason why Western interests are being harmed. Vote con.
Ready? Opponents ready? Okay, my opponents come up here and tell you that human rights abuses are extremely important. Okay, even if you buy that even if they were the most important impact in today's round, remember that without the sanctions, then Russia would have been able to expand even more their military. Just because their military is still expanding doesn't mean that it's expanding at the same rate it would have without sanctions. And also under military, they admit in their case that the sanctions brought about talks of peace in Syria. Just how we say in our case that the peace talks occur because sanctions are used as a bargaining chip. They say that there's a 33% increase, but remember, without the sanctions, there would have been an even bigger increase. And also, even if they're more incentivized to use military force, eventually Russia's going to hit a wall and be unable to continue their militarization. Next, look at the point about capital outflow. They talk about how Russia can't access loans, and they give you this card about how, like, this deal with China. I read the card. It hasn't occurred yet. They say this could happen with China, and they could be more able to access loans. What we're saying is that Russia has to pay back foreign debt, and thus they're increasing taxes on the private sectors within their economy, and thus there's a huge decrease in foreign direct investment, which is preventing them from having policy implementation, and also preventing them from trading with other regions and preventing them from spreading their influence that's anti-Western. Next, look to our card about 124 billion leaving the economy and immigration. They say this is hypothetical. No, a specific study calculated the total net impact on the economy was 124 billion, specifically due to the decrease in the economy and people leaving Russia because it's unfavorable to them. Now look to their case about when they talk about Syria. Remember, without sanctions, again, there would have been an even bigger increase in military spending. Right after the sanctions were imposed on Crimea, we saw a huge decrease in the aggression. And also about cyber warfare, remember, we're not looking at the criminals within Russia, we're looking at Russia as a governing body, and thus you must affirm.
Are you ready? Sure. Are all the judges ready for comment? Okay, perfect. Can we have the first question?
Yes.
Okay. So you keep coming up here and saying, like, oh, hypothetically, in a world without sanctions, Russia would keep expanding. But when we empirically provide you evidence that they're still expanding with sanctions, how can you make that claim?
But without sanctions, they would have been able to expand even more. And
right. How much? So can you quantify that or somehow, like, describe how?
I mean, it's just logic.
But here's what I was saying. The reason. So you're just saying that Russia wants to expand. I don't understand. The reason why Russia wants to expand in the first place is it wants to be anti-West. It wants to exert its legitimacy against the West. What happens in the world of the affirmative? The sanctions give them even
but
more.
But in the world of the negative, then we tell Russia they can do whatever they want with no consequence.
Russia doesn't want. First off, Russia wouldn't pursue as much of an anti-West expansionary policy in the world of the negative. What we literally let Ritz you. Can I just finish?
So go ahead.
Yeah, what we literally read to you in rebuttal is that these sanctions increase Putin's legitimacy, and now he's more able to go into geopolitical conflicts. He wants to oppose the West. Anti-West sentiment is up.
Okay.
Okay, do you have a question?
So I was just.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah,
so you're talking about how, like, in Syria, right, like, increased human rights abuses and things like that, right?
Oh, yeah, because
specifically
it's
because
But okay, so like you are aware that like ISIS is a huge threat to Russia as it is to the West, and that they're working together in Syria to fight ISIS, right?
No, that's actually not true. Literally.
Because the proxy war evidence that we read to is actually after, and also 90. And remember what Pranav said? 90%, only 10% of the efforts are against ISIS. 90. Can I just say?
Yeah.
Only 10% of the efforts are against ISIS. 90% of the efforts are against the rebels who attack Assad.
Right, that's evidence we can give you right now.
Just because Russia, maybe you're saying that Russia is opposing the West more than it's opposing, like, ISIS, right? But isn't it in Russia's interest to not have terrorism as well?
No. What we're saying is that he's propping up Assad to make a statement. Look to the evidence that I extend through my summary all throughout the round, where it says that their own foreign minister says that Russia would, quote, be willing to make an agreement with the West about Syria, but only if sanctions were lifted.
Right. So didn't that bring about the?
Here's what I said. The sanctions are the reason why Syrian proxy wars happen.
Sanctions are the impetus for this.
So they're using the Syrian proxy wars to say unless these.
Okay, when did they begin?
They began in 2014.
Okay.
They even have evidence for it.
2014.
Also, can I ask you a question about that China evidence that you talked about? How like the refinancing debt.
Yeah, sure.
So has that happened?
It says
your
that
card says could. Like,
it says that they've created a bank with the BRICS nations, which is Brazil, Russia. It was right down as underlined, and they have $100 billion capital financing program in which Russia can access.
Right. That's
and this is all against Western sanctions. They can go around and access these BRICS nations capital financing.
But have they been able to access that?
Yeah, because military spending has gone up 33%.
and they
But
still
it
are
would have gone up
spending.
even more without sanctions.
Yeah,
So
no,
that-
but they wouldn't even need. So here's my thing: they wouldn't even need the military spending. First off, because the reason why they're increasing the military spending is to show that they're. Remember, Putin wants to show his legitimacy, and second, they're only doing that to expose or to go into expansionary policies. I'll get to that in my final thoughts.
Or we'll take the remaining 5 seconds. Okay, that's time.
Okay. So, we were just going to be going over two main issues with the affirmative and then two main voters for the negative. Okay. Pranav, you ready?
Yep.
Judges ready? Judges ready? Let's begin with visiting the biggest issue with them. They come up here and tell you that capital outflow is hurting Russia a lot. What do we say to you? First off, they have been at an all-time high in FDI. That right there shows you that the economy is doing just fine without sanctions. What does that leave? Their economy is doing really fine. Only thing that's happening in Russia right now is increased anti-West sentiment. But second, we read you the evidence that what happens right now is that Russia goes around the Western states. They stop their financing with the Western states, but what do? They go to China, they go to Brazil, they go to Russia, which has which already gave them $100 billion in capital, and they have a yuan ruble exchange policy where they can do the same things before. So what do they tell you? Oh, they can't access any loans. They are still just anti-West, they hate the West more, but now they have the capability to actually get the loans still. That just increases their capability, and now they have an impetus to use that to expand into areas. Second main reason they're wrong with their case is going to be an expansion. We essentially turn this whole thing around them. What do we say? Putin has more of an expansionary impetus and motivation in the world of the affirmative. Why? One, he wants to show his legitimacy. Two, we read through the DW.com evidence that says that he pursues geopolitical conflicts in the scenario that the sanctions increases anti-West sentiment. He wants to show that either his military or his wealth perception is increasing. What we show you is that military spending has been an all-time high, 33%. Right there shows you that he has the expansionary policies. We give you Central Asia, we give you Syria, and we give you Ukraine. All those are happening right now, and one, Syria is explicitly stated to be an anti-West reaction. That is because of sanctions, not because of a world without sanctions. He is pursuing in Syria 90% of the time he's attacking the rebels who try to overthrow Assad. Now, this actually links back into our case. One, because we tell you human rights. That's the first voter issue. Human rights. When we stop Assad, because the sanctions are helping Assad in the long term, Assad has been killing over 10,000 people. We read you the evidence that Assad has been he's been abusing human rights in Syria. Obviously, you can see it through the refugee crisis. But second, you can see that in Syria, the proxy wars have actually come in 2014 insofar they want to oppose the sanctions. Why are they doing that? They're saying, one, the sanctions started. Now they go into Syria, they induce proxy wars to say that we want the sanctions to come down. Not the other way around. Sanctions aren't reducing the Syrian proxy war. They're causing it, and they're using the Syrian proxy war to take them down. Second voter issue is going to be, that's the reason why you're voting for the affirmative, because all that happens is anti-West sentiment causing it to expansion. Thanks.
So starting now, so our opponents keep arguing that human rights are being violated, yet they don't seem to realize that without sanctions there would have been even more human rights abuse. About Syria, the West and Russia are actually working together to fight their common enemy, which is ISIS. It's in Russia's best interest to limit the threat of ISIS, and the only way to do so is to work with Assad. They claim that Putin wants to increase his legitimacy. This flows to our side because that implies that Russia would have only continued aggression if not for sanctions. Even if militarization is increasing, which it isn't because Russian troops are leaving Ukraine, the impact of Putin's loss of power internationally limits his influence on creating geopolitical conflicts as well. Just because he has expansionary plans, they haven't actually occurred, and Putin likes to talk more than he acts. Just because he claims to increase militarization, that doesn't mean that he actually has the ability to do so. There's no way to get resources for military activism or funding to polarize politicization in EU countries if the funds that the military budget is coming from is being depleted. Our opponents say that Russia turns to China, yet trade with China has actually decreased by 30%, and investment in Russia is decreasing from all other countries. This goes directly against what they say about Putin turning to BRICS and other countries because their cards about financing never state that Russia has been able to access those funds at all. Remember also that the cyber attacks are only 1.7% of attacks from Russia, which they never responded to. Remember that as a direct result of sanctions, capital outflow has happened and increased by 250%. Remember that sanctions cripple the Russian economy through reduction of foreign investment and thus prevent Russia from spreading its anti-Western influence through detrimental warfare and trade. Economic sanctions have been effective in preventing this military modernization through two avenues, the economic drain and deterrence. We've seen significant drawbacks in Russian troops in Ukraine, and because of sanctions, the reluctance of Russia to pursue even more military activism despite Putin's claims. So for the safety of the United States and other Western countries, please affirm. Thank you.
Great round.
I'm kind of sick right now.
Great round, but really great round.
Thanks so much, judges.
Thanks so much for judging.
Can I your Russian central bank for FDI and your Moscow for FDI?
Yeah.
Your Russian central bank card.
All-time high.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Yeah.
After that, can I say that the access to loans through this one rebel?
Yeah.
Isn't it's on the bottom? We'll get to it right after.
Is it just in this file?
The control is one. Yeah, that's the whole part and the golden part.
Okay.
Yeah, after you all look at the you want approval thing, I would like to see it.
Okay.
Is it?
Yeah.
Sorry,
The bolded card.
the Simon de Gilbert.
Mm-hmm. Any other pieces of that, or? Okay, awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah, no problem.
It's about to die.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have it. Okay, so it's a 2-1 decision for Khan. So congratulations to both teams. And if you present Chaparral with...
Yeah, I swirled, so I'll go first. So, the one thing, when I just go through the flow, I drop your first contention, because by the end of the round it has no offense. Only offense I find in your case is where you talk about these FDI outflows. And so when I compare your two things, like there seems to be a discrepancy. So in your first contention, you never really talk about this at all, but your impact that you try and make really important in your first contention is how this freedom of the press has been drastically cut. You say it's like been cut by 132%. And so that leads into the discrepancy when you're quoting the Moscow Times as to the factual legitimacy compared to, like, this is the Russian Federation Central Bank saying we got our ass handed to us in FDI outflows. But like even then, so my other problem is like even if I dropped your human rights, because you basically don't talk about it, all that's left for me is voting. I basically throw your human rights into their like government transparency, democracy, like as an overall framework. And then at that point, I just don't seem to be getting enough reasons as to why, like, Russia's, because you don't give me like a quantitative, why is what Russia is doing right now, like overall in their interventions within like Syria so bad. You just say like there's been a rampant abuses by Assad, but when they say like, so they say that like, so Russia in December 18th agreed to like to push, like they're saying like Assad can go, and to that point there's a problem for you, or I'm like, if Russia, like, because you never give me a reason to believe that Russia just willingly went to the table to make that agreement, when in the status quo sanctions exist. You don't give me a reason to believe that like it wasn't the sanctions that made them go to like make any agreement, regardless of how strong it was. And so at that point, when they say like Russia, even if it's half-heartedly, is like agreeing like, hey, Assad can leave, I have more weight to say that sanctions have at least done something to fulfill the framework.
Okay. Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So I'm not like asserting anything, but our card just said that like the Moscow or the person said that they would come to the table if sanctions were taken out. So we were just saying that like the actual motivation for the proxy wars were due to the sanctions. Or we like what was like wrong in our presentation?
I think with that, so they're literally saying like, as a result, they will go to the table because of sanctions. So I like look at it as like, sure, sanctions,
Okay.
like sanctions are the key integral as to whether they do something or not.
Okay.
And when they still say in December 18th, like Russia came to some form of agreement saying like, hey, like we'll like do some, we're like okay a bit more with Assad leaving. They're like saying like sanctions still haven't been lifted, but like even if it's a half-hearted agreement, Russia's still saying we'll tolerate not Assad being president in Syria.
Okay.
So I'll start from the beginning of the debate. So you all start with this human rights Syria cyber war. I end up giving them the human rights violation, and I'll tell you why in a second. Syria was kind of whatever. Cyber war, I don't really evaluate whatsoever, because in the later half of the debate, didn't really impacted enough for me to really know what to do with it. So the reason why I give them this human rights violations is because you don't really have any sort of answers to that. In absence of sanctions, there will be more military aggression, which probably means there will be more human rights violation. There's actually probably still a lot more human rights violations that would happen in absence of sanctions, right? You don't have an answer to that, so I give them that. Problem with you, the reason why I end up voting for them is because, so again, from the beginning of the debate, right, you have this aggression advantage, this like the economy argument, and this brain drain, right? I don't evaluate brain drain, you don't really do anything with it. The question then becomes this military aggression versus economy, right? So I end up giving that to them. I think they're winning that the economy is being driven, the military aggression is being driven by this economy, which is being driven by this partnership being with other countries. So what I mean by that is, so this is my train of thought, which I get from them is, what happens is you put the sanctions in, Russia goes to other countries like China, they're like, hey, listen, what we're gonna do? They're like, okay, fine, let's make a partnership, we'll give you money. Putin goes, awesome, I'm gonna use this money, I'm gonna be more aggressive now, right? So I give them this military aggression and economy, that their economy is better now because of sanctions, which is driving their aggression to con, right? At that point, it's a question of human rights versus military aggression, right? So the issue then becomes is, again, the argument that you initially made, and it's kind of blippy on their end, and I get to do work for them, was that their argument is in military aggression, when they go in, they give the example of Syria, when they go in, the people, they abuse people. That's an example of military, example of human rights violation. So I end up giving them that they win military aggression, that sanctions cause more military aggression due to this economic partnership with their countries, which probably means that there's going to be more human rights violations as there's increased military aggression. If that makes sense. So you win human rights, they win military aggression, but military aggression makes human rights worse.
Okay, and so for me, I wouldn't necessarily go as far as like his decision and say that you all are winning on human rights, but I just don't really evaluate it because like neither team is showing me like it just becomes a wash toward the end of the debate, and so like I don't even evaluate it. But what I am looking at, I'm looking at this idea of expansion, and like he said, this military aggression, like. They're proving to me that this aggression is actually happening. You all concede, and they bring it back into the debate, you all concede that expansions are happening, but then you basically concede, but you say that expansions would not be happening as much without the sanctions in place. But then they go on further to show me like why that because of sanctions, like this military aggression has increased, thus actually expanding Putin's influence. Additionally, I do vote on this like 124 billion. Yeah, like so I vote on that. Like I do buy their card about this like yuan ruble exchange. I read the card. It's the only card that really comes into question for me in context of this debate. And I give them the win on that card because if they can access the money from China, then I think that Putin, they're right. Like he does two things to assert his power. That's either through money or through military. And with this exchange with China, they're able to do that. I give them the win. All right.
Questions?
I just had some. So the yuan, the MOU that like they just did, the MOU that Russia has signed with China. I've seen it like this whole tournament. It's not being. I don't think it's being understood properly. The MOU does not mean Russia can now like invest in other countries with the yuan. It just simply means that instead of using the dollar to back their foreign reserves, they're exchanging rubles and adding more backing of the Chinese yuan as their currency. It gives them no further access into financial markets. They don't get more inroads because the current sanctions exist as the Russian federal government and its financial institutions, like by name, cannot go in and take loans out. The MOU does not allow them any inroads into the Western investment, but rather gives them a different backing that may allow their currency to not slide as much.
Okay.
I don't know, their evidence says like the opposite.
Yeah.
It actually says like this.
Their evidence is saying like the MOU gives them loans, but not loans as in like they can go and invest.
So that part was the second part, like the
$100 billion.
part.
The breaks?
Yeah, like if you
They're
kept
being an
reading,
NCB
like,
bank,
making
that's
two
the breaks
sentences down.
Okay.
I guess I didn't go for that much, but the NCB bank was like.
Yeah, and then you've got to do a little bit better with like time economy because like you ran out of time. You say you're going to go back to something, you never get back to it. This could have been a debate that could have gone either way, really. But yeah, you all ran out of time on some key things. Luckily, it didn't come down to those things.